My name is Bialystok. I'm Associate Professor in Ethics and Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and I am Acting Director of the Centre for Ethics at the University of Toronto. Oh, that's a mouthful. Delighted to be here. Thank you so much to Mira for the invitation, and I'm very excited for the conversation we're about to have with these three panelists. So I will introduce the panelists very briefly. They will each speak to you a little bit about their areas of expertise and their understanding of educational ethics, after which we will, of course, proceed to answer all of the questions that Mira just posed to us and launch a field together. After our panelists have spoken, we're going to pause and do a quick talk in turn, so you'll have a couple of minutes to sort of digest what you've just heard and dialogue with people near you. And then I'm going to facilitate a conversation with the four of us, and then there are two mics in the aisles, and we'll invite questions from the audience to wrap up the session. So let me introduce these speakers to you. I'm not going to give you their whole impressive CVs. I'm just going to give you their titles, and you will have to learn about all of their accolades and knowledge through their comments instead of me just rattling them off before they speak. So first we have Carolina Brito, who is the principal of the Rafael Hernández Dual Language K-8 School in Boston. Next, to my left, we have Terri Wilson, who is Associate Professor in the School of Education at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And on the far end, we have Natasha, who is the Lenore Stern Professor in the Social Sciences in the Department of Sociology at Tufts University. And that is the order in which they're going to speak. So without further delay, I'd like to invite Carolina to start us off.
It works. Okay, great. Soy Carolina, soy la directora de la Rafael Hernández Escuela de Doble Inmersión aquí in Roxbury. I am a very, very proud dual language principal. And just to get to know my crowd, how many of you have been in a school classroom during and after the pandemic as a teacher or administrator? Okay, fantastic. You have an understanding then that the ethical dilemmas for schools have radically changed as a result of the world that we built on Zoom and the world that we are building after. And I think I heard Mira speak this morning. Full disclosure, I was a student in her class, which is why I am here to begin with. Wrote a case study once, and that actually opened up a way of thinking about the thousands of decisions that I had to make as a teacher every day, and now that I have to make as a school leader. I would say a couple of things. I think as we talk about educational ethics, I think the biggest pitfall that I get nervous about when hearing some of the questions on the table is that when you're in a school, all of you who have been in those buildings teaching those classrooms, the thousands of decisions that you make are time sensitive. There is not an option to have a cute intellectual conversation with a colleague in the hall when the kid is dysregulated and screaming and about to tear your classroom up, right? So what is it that we can actually take from a field when you don't have the luxury of time to be, like doing the whole Ralph Waldo Emerson thing, take a walk and make a decided consideration? Because that ain't reality, right? So how do you operate in a field when you don't have your bioethicist on call? Like there's no speed dial 911 helpline, be like, hey, do I suspend this kid or not? And that actually is a bad example because that is one of the few times you do actually have to pause. And so when you're operating in a time-sensitive way as a teacher or as a school leader, I would actually propose that on the micro scale, which is the scale that I love, there's categories of things that we have to explore as an opening for why ethics matters in classrooms. There are some decisions that because we get to impasse, so like my suspension conversation earlier, my teacher evaluation thing that Mira mentioned, how we allocate budget and resources during budget season in Boston Public Schools is January. I spend 2 to 3 months building a staffing plan, figuring out how to configure the money according to all the rules. We have report card time. There are moments in the year where the decisions you make, kind of like a Supreme Court ruling from back in the day when we trusted the Supreme Court, has the power to put an ethical line in the sand, like a criterion for decision making that is going to influence how you make 5,000 decisions tomorrow morning. So there are moments in the school year where you are forced to slow down, but they are not considered points of ethical decision making. Typically they're considered points of like, oh, let's solicit feedback from the community. Or, what are our values and how do we live them if you're lucky, right? And even then those like, how are our values and how do we live them take second place to, what are the school goals that we put on paper and sent to the superintendent? Or like, what are the scores that we want to reach and therefore have to allocate the money to reach them, right? But instead, if we were to consider those moments of pause and slow down, like I'll just take one in particular that I'm thinking about right now. You might know this, but Boston Public Schools is moving towards full inclusion in the next couple of years. It's been a very big conversation in our city. I'm in a dual language school. We are a linguistic inclusion school. We don't have separate ESL services because we believe that your mother tongue is going to help you acquire a second language, right? It's a beautiful thing. Come and visit. So we've always been a linguistic inclusion school, but now we have to figure out special education. So what do you do in a school, which I think is fantastic, by the way, but what do you do in a school that's already underfunded to serve multilingual learners that isn't right-sourced and right-staffed, and then suddenly you have to disperse funds to also figure out a thing that no one in the district has figured out yet for a population of students that has what Boston is sort of narrating as the double bind of being multilingual and having special needs, because that's the target demographic that right now in Boston has the lowest achievement outcomes, right? So what do you do when you're already strapped to do one version of inclusion and you have to do a second? What goes? What stays? And I was thinking about the thing that Mira mentioned at the beginning of our conversation today. That's when you call in your handy-dandy bioethicist and you're like, can you help me reframe the problems? Because the parents are saying they want this. Teachers are saying, we want this. Kids are like, I don't need, why am I sitting here doing hours of testing for both special education and OEL, right? So when you have three very potent stakeholders at the table who are all motivated by the value of like protecting their kids, what are the tensions? How can we reframe those tensions at that table so that we're having a conversation about something in common instead of each person defending their fight or their particular narrow perspective? And most decisions in Boston Public Schools right now have this lived tension of like, shoot, we gotta respond to the thing that we got in trouble on the like front page of the Boston Globe for, versus the thing that's actually affecting kids. And that's what rules the roost: power, political conversation, and very rarely ethics. Oh yeah, and I forgot money, because that goes with power, right? So like, what can we afford? Who's gonna yell at us the loudest if we don't do it? What's the Globe gonna do? And what are the parents gonna show up at school committee to make us do? But ethics is an absent presence in that as a particular thing to even consider when making a decision. And I really do believe that if in these big moments of decision, you make a call and you say, you know what? The rights of our most vulnerable trump the majority decision. That's the line we're ethically making in the sand. Then that piece of reasoning extends to how you make 5,000 micro decisions in the day. And then we have an opportunity to actually define what equity over equality means, because actually nobody, like people use equity in very different ways in Boston, right? So that's where I think this has possibility.
Thank you. Terri.
Hi. Oh, it is on. Okay, well, thanks, Carolina, for those great comments and some conversations we've been able to have over the last few years. And I come to these framing questions, or the questions that Mira posed to us, as a philosopher of education who thinks about issues of education policy, particularly about some of the moral and ethical questions associated with school choice, the limits of parents' rights in education, and the rights of families to opt out of aspects of public education they may oppose. But as I was thinking about today's remarks, and maybe because I was in conversation with Carolina, I've been thinking a little bit more about what I do in one of my other lives, and I'm sure many of us in this room have these other lives, right? But I serve as a parent representative on my kids' school accountability committee, and also as on our school district's accountability committee. And in Colorado, where I'm from, this is a state law that there's a school-based and district-based, site-based decision-making group. And the last couple years, I've been chairing our district's policy committee, which recommends and advises the school board on various policy issues and changes. And I think this work, just as much as my vantage point as a philosopher, has really shaped how I've been thinking about some of these pressing, everyday ethical issues in education. Some of the issues we've been tackling are about the design of gifted and talented programs and pathways for math acceleration in the curriculum. Debates about the presence of police, or what we call school resource officers in Colorado. Differential funding for higher needs classrooms and how to allocate that, limits on parent fundraising, and this year really tackling the redesign of our open enrollment policies in the district. And I think both of these vantage points have really contributed to how I thought about the two framing questions of the panel. And Mira asked us to think about these two. What are some key questions in educational ethics that we've been grappling with? And second, why haven't we answered these questions already? Or why haven't these questions been sufficiently answered by either philosophers of education, or by the available ethical codes of conduct that we have already? So first, just thinking about the issues, I think that, so many of us in this room, even by opening a newspaper, can think of lots of pressing ethical issues facing education, perhaps particularly over the last few years as justice-oriented efforts in education about race and the persistence of racism, about gender and sexual diversity, have been challenged in primary, secondary, and higher education settings. Many of us here know, but in the US context, we've had over 200 education gag orders, right, that have been proposed in at least 40 of our state legislatures. 16 states have passed bills that prohibit teaching about racial inequality, white privilege, gender identity, and a range of other topics. Such bills increasingly target teachers, threatening to fire, sue, or sanction educators or leaders for failing to endorse such standards, or for failing to present a range of competing viewpoints. I think these attacks have sharpened some of the ethical choices or the ethical stakes, and certainly the very material consequences that are facing teachers and leaders. I think also that these attacks have very effectively and cleverly nationalized and politicized questions. So turning us to questions about, is your district teaching CRT? Rather, they've effectively politicized these much more everyday ethical decisions that teachers and principals are making all the time, right? Not just whether I teach this book, but how do I teach the book? How do I ask that first question? How do I include those folks? So I think as unique as these current circumstances are, though, these challenges are maybe just the sharper or more visible edge of much more long-standing debates in public education. And most of us here know that these debates are not just technical questions of how do we teach, but really embedded in those are deeply moral and political questions about, what should be taught, for whom, on what authority, and for what ends. And here I think some of the ethical questions that I think are most pressing are really, to what extent do we all participate in certain kinds of educational experiences, shared standards, or curriculum? How do we make decisions about what has to be shared and what might vary, and for whom and why? What accommodations or compromises do we make for some families and parents? And how do we think about families with more or less power in those cases? And how are those balanced to what we might owe all children? In earlier conversations, when we talked about this before, Carolina had just come literally from a conversation about how to balance the needs of a family with a trans kiddo who needed to safely use a restroom and a family who is deeply religious, right? It had just happened the moment before our conversation. And I think here, ethical dilemmas are really about what we owe to each other. What do we owe that family with pretty profound religious concerns? And what do we owe to the family and the kid who needs safety and support? And how, not necessarily do we choose between them, sometimes we do, but I think often principals and teachers are tasked at trying to negotiate competing and overlapping demands. And I think here, this is one thing that's really striking about educational dilemmas, is that we're almost always asking these questions in a very non-ideal context, with finite, often and mostly inadequate resources that require very difficult and necessary choices. I think another sort of unique feature of educational ethics is that local policymakers, school boards, district leaders, and certainly teachers and administrators are not usually asked to answer such questions either abstractly or definitively. They're often asked or tasked to craft multiple kinds of imperfect, messy compromises. And I think the other feature that's really important to note is that teachers and local decision makers are always making those choices in particular contexts, with particular histories, with particular personalities, in specific communities. And I think all those unique features suggest maybe a little bit of light, or shed some light on the second question Mira posed to us, which is effectively like, why haven't philosophers or philosophers of education or ethical codes sufficiently addressed questions of educational ethics yet? And I think, I want to suggest just two possible reasons or possible contrasts between some of the standard ways that philosophers work and the perhaps different demands of educational ethics. I think one reason is that philosophers are more likely to focus our attention on sharp examples rather than more ordinary and complex cases. And I think that's probably true of ethical codes of conduct too, which often are driven by the outliers or the extreme cases. For example, in my field, I think I consider how many philosophers and philosophers of education take up debates about school choice and parents' rights through the lens of canonical legal cases, like Wisconsin v. Yoder or Mozart v. Hawkins. And those examples are really useful. They sharpen the conceptual edges of debate, right? They create like a sharp lens, frame a clear choice between cultural values of some families and the interests, perhaps, of a liberal democracy. And those are useful, but they can also obscure some important complexity. So here, philosopher Judith Suissa has argued that they sort of reify or assume that families hold a more comprehensive or more fixed conception of the good than they might. And here I think the other reason why philosophers may not be equipped to do this is that philosophers like to talk and think about reasons, right? I'm doing it right now. I'm offering you some reasons. And I've been thinking lately that both philosophers and policymakers tend to focus on the reasons that parents or protesters or school board members have for opposing or supporting various policies. But I want to suggest that actually in practice, those reasons are much less definitive and much less set than we might appreciate. Parents, for instance, often hold multiple competing, overlapping, sometimes contradictory viewpoints. They often find themselves changing their mind. And here lately I've been drawn to this contrast that philosopher Tony Layden makes about reasonings and what he describes as a more complex social picture of reasoning, right? He has a really nice take on this, but he often says that philosophers employ reasons like foot soldiers, right? Whose job is to defeat the opposition and defend a position. But in contrast, the activity of reasoning is more like a conversation and an invitation with others. And of course, I'm totally overstating these contrasts. Like, philosophy can be and should be a space of complexity and reasoning. But I do think engaging seriously in educational ethics requires us as philosophers to do slightly different things than we usually do. But it's also an opportunity. And here I think that engaging with ethical dilemmas can actually help us do better philosophy, to make better, more nuanced, more precise, more grounded normative arguments. I think in some ways by helping us understand the complexity and variability of the values, about the importance of different contexts, but I think also importantly asking us to reason in conversation with others. And I guess that's my final last third contrast, is that it's not enough for us to learn how to reason individually, like to develop ethical positions and defend them, but to really think about how we deliberate and reason together. And to me, that's really the promise of, the democratic promise of ethical inquiry. And in some ways asks us as philosophers not to work alone, but to engage in the messier, more complex reality of talking about the ethical dimensions of our policy and practice with partners, but also to think about how we're helping others do that work too. So, thanks.
Thank you, Terri. And Natasha.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you, Mira, for this invitation to be part of this conversation. I'm a sociologist, so I tend to think about, broad structures and cultural processes that shape our social world. So this is a great opportunity to think about, well, how do those social processes create tensions and dilemmas? A little bit out of my wheelhouse, but Mira asked me to talk about some ethical dilemmas of higher education. So I'm going to talk about, just from what I know, there are hundreds and hundreds of ethical dilemmas in higher education. I'm going to focus on two that arise particularly in private higher education, one related to admissions and then related to money, to finance. So the first one is about admissions. So, we have this idea of meritocracy in American society. It's really part of our American ideology, this idea that people get rewarded for some kinds of, socially desired qualities, right? So if we think about it, admissions, some forms of achievement or accomplishment or smarts or skills, what have you, that is desired by the college. On the one hand, we have this, and this, meritocracy is very much part of our American ideology, of the American dream, of equal opportunity, right? If we have, equal opportunity and we live in a meritocratic society, then everyone has an opportunity to achieve the American dream. This is sort of, a version of, the American ideal that I think really penetrates our society. On the other hand, we live in a vastly unequal society, and our inequality is growing, right? Both by class, by race, and other forms of inequality, gender identity, and so on. And so how do we think about unequal opportunities and growing inequality in the context of our belief in this American dream and meritocracy, et cetera? It's hard to sometimes think about what is a kind of true or fair meritocracy given inequality. How do you do that when you have vastly different starting points? Can you really compensate for those different starting points? And what does that look like? And then at the same time, what is the alternative? If our answer is, no, we can't do that because we're too unequal, then what's the alternative? What do we do otherwise? And I think that's the other thing that I kind of think about a lot when I think about admissions. And so if we take it to the level of selective college admissions, and I want to point out most colleges are not selective, but for those that are, and the US Supreme Court is weighing on this in terms of affirmative action right now, but how do we admit students and talk about admissions in a way that satisfies a few different things? So I'm gonna name three. First, how do we admit students and talk about admissions in a way that is as fair as possible to all applicants despite unequal opportunities? I mentioned growing inequality. Most colleges have limited financial aid. Certainly many are not need blind. Even if they are, even at a uber wealthy place like Harvard is admitting a large number of students who can afford to pay more than the median household income in this country, so clearly not a cross-section of young people in the United States. And there are other interests of the university. You know, the squash coach wants his squash players or her squash players, or, you know, the crew team, things that are not available to every single young person in this country. So how do we think about that? The unequal opportunities with choosing students from the large number of students who are saying, I want to come to this university. And how do we make those decisions? And second, how do we do this in a way that doesn't reinforce misinformed ideas about worthiness and deservingness of an elite education? You know, so many young people and families think of college admission as a kind of individualist meritocracy. Thank you. Oh, wow, that time went fast. So how do we think about, not seeing where someone is going to college or where they got in as a sign of their worthiness, and where we got rejected from as a sign of, well, these people who got in are more worthy or deserving than these people who did not, given what I was saying earlier. And what is the signaling and the language around that? And third, how do we admit students and talk about admissions in a way that impacts teen behaviors and parents of teens in ways that are healthy and productive, right? So we know that there's a growing mental health crisis. I mean, there was a mental health crisis among teens prior to the pandemic that's just been exacerbated. And a lot of kind of the downward pressure of college admissions is also affecting teens. So how do we think about that? So those are, I see these kind of values of, defining the best or the most deserving and, as one piece. Another is kind of a need-blind value, but there are constraints, right, to being a need-blind college, and how we define the best. We might, as a sociologist, I would say it's ideological, but it's certainly socially defined, right? What is the best? How do we define that? So that's admissions. And then the second area that I've been thinking a lot about recently is money and finance. And this is a dilemma for university leadership, the finance department, the development office. There's a fundamental tension between college education as a private good that individuals pay for, and this is even true of public higher education because so much of public higher education is tuition-driven and not actually funded by states, even though they're state universities, versus something that is, most colleges in their mission statement talk about wanting to contribute to a society. It's, to our kind of collective human flourishing. And, we increasingly also see at the individual level higher education as something that's necessary for a kind of good life, right? So how do colleges that are funded in large part by tuitions again that are very high, higher than what most families can afford, and how do we think about that in decisions? And I think this affects a lot of decisions, and I'm just going to name a few. So the first is decisions on spending, right? So we have a little bit of an arms race in higher education, and particularly elite higher education, in terms of the fancy new student center or the new athletic center. There's this great podcast by Malcolm Gladwell where he talks about the food at Vassar College versus Bowdoin College, right? So these are two kind of Northeast liberal colleges that are competing for somewhat similar students. Vassar has put more money into financial aid, does not have very good food apparently. Bowdoin apparently has very nice food. The students are very happy with the food. It's a big selling point when students come on tours, less financial aid. And Vassar administrators talk about how when Bowdoin does that, it makes it even harder for Vassar to make those decisions not to do that. So it's also affecting what other colleges can do and how they can spend their money if they still want to get enough students. And so how do we make those decisions about where to put our dollars? And then donors. I see these ethical dilemmas related to donors. The money that is donated to elite places versus public. So I'll give you one example. I remember when Michael Bloomberg gave all this money to Johns Hopkins University, and I was like, come on. He was the former mayor of New York City. Couldn't you give that money to the CUNY system? Because, the City University of New York system, where is a huge engine for social mobility for working class people in New York City, right? And, in contrast, Johns Hopkins, a much smaller college, But then, so our new president at Tufts, where I'm on the faculty, is coming from Johns Hopkins, and he, expressed a commitment to expanding access to our university, which we don't have a great track record on. And he said, thank you, that he said, the Bloomberg money helped Hopkins become a not tuition-driven university, and I was like, oh, that's the dilemma, right? So as a faculty member at Tufts, I want us to be much more inclusive. But in order to do that, we have to convince donors to give to us. And that money perhaps is not going to UMass Boston or community colleges in the area. So how do we think about these dilemmas also across organizations? So one of the things I was thinking about earlier is, a kind of hospital ethics committee is about sort of competing interests within the hospital, but how do we think about and adjudicate conflicts that are between organizations, right? Where you may be employed by one organization, but you can see how what your organization is doing is affecting people on the outside. Sorry, and the last one I'll say about money is just as universities, where do we draw the line? So Ken Griffin, a big donor to Ron DeSantis' presidential campaign, donated $300 million to Harvard. As a result, the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, where my degree is from, is now the Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Where do we say, the dilemma might be, well, if we can put that $300 million to financial aid, is that worth it? Or are we saying, does that symbolic value say cost more than that, or how do we make those decisions related to money as well? So I look forward to the discussion. Those are just two kind of areas of ethics that I think about in higher education.
Thank you so much to all three of you. What an invigorating start to this conversation and this conference, I would say. We have so much to tackle here. Before I start asking questions back to our speakers, I want you to take a few minutes to reflect, maybe speak to a couple people next to you about what you just heard. So talk in turn, please. Okay, I'm going to interrupt. Am I on? Am I on?
And they totally missed.
I'm interrupting your conversations. I'm used to being ignored when I tell people to stop talking. That's what parenting is all about. Okay, welcome back, everyone. You will have more opportunity to speak, I promise. Thank you. There will be lots more opportunity to speak. Thank you. So we're going to go back to a conversation here, and then you will also have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists a little bit later. So whatever you're talking about, hold those thoughts, hold your questions, and we'll come back to them shortly. So I want to pick up on some of the incredible food for thought that we've been given in these opening presentations here and try to circle back to some of the framing questions that Miura gave us in the opening about what would it mean to have a field of educational ethics, and why don't we apparently have one yet? We have no shortage of ethical dilemmas in education. You've just heard about many dozens of them, just as a small sampling, from K-12 schooling to higher education to policymaking and politics and parents, and the list goes on. There's no shortage of need for ethical thinking. There is no shortage of ethical decision-making and passionate and justice-oriented people in education, teachers, administrators, parents, and so on, who recognize that they are being called upon to act in a normative way on behalf of other people all the time. There's no shortage of academic thinking on some of these ethical problems, and philosophers of education in particular have devoted attention to some of the very things that our panelists have talked about, as Terri also referenced. So I want to dig into what I'm seeing as some of the disconnects here that can maybe help us begin to explain why this has failed to coalesce into a field, why we are all talking in many ways about educational ethics, and yet tragically not talking to each other or to the people who matter at the right time in the right ways in order to achieve things that we think need to be done. So just picking up on some of the things that the three of you said, here are just some disconnects I heard about. One is a disconnect between stakeholders, which Carolina, you certainly referenced as in referring to your work as a principal. parents have interests, teachers have interests, administrators have interests, you're accountable to school boards and policies and so on. There are many stakeholders, and they regularly talk past each other, not, and correct me if I'm wrong, not necessarily because they believe in different things, although clearly that also happens, but because we're talking in different registers. And something that I was reflecting on yesterday at the pre-conference is how ethics discussions happen in multiple registers, and everybody thinks they're talking about ethics, but that doesn't mean they're all mutually intelligible. So there's a sort of failure of mutual intelligibility or vocabulary, as well as sometimes a failure of alignment in interests or priorities. And that's at the level of educational decision-making in the really fast-paced environment that Carolina was talking about. There's also, of course, the disconnect between the more slow-paced, luxurious, ethical reasoning that we get to do in academia, even if we have other lives as parents or advocates or teachers, but in the luxurious space of thinking about ethics without being called upon to make immediate decisions, without having so many people in front of us to whom we're immediately accountable. And Terri, you talked about how that tends to happen in the form of reasons and according to philosophical paradigms with long histories, which may make sense to us and may be valuable in their own right, but don't necessarily translate into the other areas where ethical decision-making actually happens in education. This also seems to overlap with the disconnect that is sort of temporal and spatial. And I was just thinking about the vivid picture you painted, Carolina, of life in the school versus what is, I think, to most of us, the recognizable halls of academia that Terri, you referred to, and Natasha talking about the ethics of decision-making about who gets to enter those spaces and what it means to gain admission to the elite luxurious spaces where something like ethical reasoning can happen maybe at its own natural pace instead of at the breakneck speed it has to happen in the halls of schools. And so there's a sort of temporal and spatial disconnect as well. There's obviously disconnects over values where even when we're using the same words, we don't always know what they mean. I heard reference to a lot of fuzzy or ambiguously defined values, no surprise to me, but we can name many others. Some of the ones that came up in your comments are inclusion, like the inclusion of special education students and inclusion of multilingual students and so on. Equity, meritocracy, the best. These are all value words that on some level everybody signs on to and you hear bandied about a lot, but how do we get to actually clarify what we mean by those values? And what are the costs? What are the ethical consequences when they are used as stand-ins or as shorthand because we don't have time or we aren't in conversation with the right other people to really hash out what we mean by them? So those are just some of the disconnects, and I'm also thinking about the disconnect between the way that we conceive of a field, especially a field with a sort of academic sounding name like ethics that has, again, hallowed histories in some disciplines and in some institutions, but also very everyday meanings, and how we conceive of professionalism and the work of doing education, and why these things don't seem to have yet coalesced in a satisfactory way. So I want to start by sort of throwing that back to you. First of all, am I reflecting some of your concerns accurately? Do you see these as disconnects? Are there other disconnects that I've missed that you'd like to add to our consideration here? And do you think this is a useful way of starting to think about why we don't have a coherent, identifiable field of educational ethics? Natasha?
That's a tough question. So I don't know that I can answer that last question. I think I kind of alluded to this at the end, that I sort of weakly formulated a thought in my mind, but I think what's kind of I get stuck on is just how do you implement like educational ethics when these organizations are separate, right? So if I think about particularly higher education, right? So even, so certainly private higher education, right? They're individual organizations making decisions, and making decisions for that organization. But it has impact on the rest of society, right? And so, what Bowdoin is doing has impact on what Vassar can do and still, attract enough students to meet its, bottom line and all of that, right? And so where does the ethicist, or how do you pull out those ethical dilemmas? And where's the space for that conversation is what I'm thinking about. I think about, I'm actually on the board of a private school, and every time I try to say, well, try to talk about the impact of what we're doing on kids who don't go to the school or schools outside of the walls or the public schools, it's like, that's not what we're here for, right? That's not your job as a president, and it's not, right? But then whose job is it, right? Okay, so it's the state. But the state, then I think about the state, but the state can only doesn't really play that role either. I mean, a little bit through decision-making around money, but, and regulation, but I feel like that's where I see the role of educational ethics, but I just don't know, maybe I'm a sociologist, so I think, where does it fit in society, right? In these, and that's, when I was hearing the examples of bioethics, I was like, oh, it seems so much clearer, because you're a hospital, you're talking about resources to this patient or that patient or to this family or, these doctors, and it's within the organization, but this is across, and I think that's where I'm feeling like, oh, where does that conversation happen in a way that will impact decisions that people make? Sorry,
so there's gaps as well. No, that's great. So there's also gaps. There's these vacant spaces between the people who are making decisions and thinking about things, and it's not always clear who's accountable for certain ethical outcomes.
That's right.
I really appreciate Natasha's sort of invitation for us to think sociologically about why there's no field, right? To really think about what are the spaces and structures and resources that support a field. And Mira was talking about this in her opening, about positions and lines and phone numbers and things, the scaffolding of a field, right? And I think it would be really interesting to go back to those moments of bioethics or to even any fields. The lines between fields are blurry and they coalesce, but how do they coalesce and what sort of structures does that require of us? I think would be really useful work to engage in, almost like history of the professions and things like that. I think the other, to me, the other disconnect that your comments really brought home to me particularly about these naturalized ideologies that we operate in, I think that a lot of ethical issues in education aren't necessarily seen as ethical issues because we take them so deeply for granted, right? So even a very basic ethical question of the one you just brought up, why should some children have more than others? And how can we allow that to be, right? We take the inequality as a fact, right? As a naturalized phenomenon and not as a question or a choice we made or a structure that we should think about. So I think that's another, to me, disconnect.
Do you think that people fail to realize that that's an injustice, or they just feel defeated and disempowered, that they can't do anything to rectify the injustice?
I don't know. I think very few people would argue that it's just, but I do think people see it as naturally the case. I think some people would probably argue it's just, but not defensible arguments.
I'm also trying to zoom out on your question. I'm thinking how this would play out in the real world. Boston School Committee sits down together. Hey, do you think we should hire an ethicist? And then 5,000 people pop out of the woodworks. Why is an ethicist more important than insert position X for the inequity that hasn't been fixed yet? So why this? Because ethics is ultimately, as you said, a luxury good in the collective public imagination, instead of an inherent part of how we do bread and butter business every damn day. So I think it's an interesting, I've worked in every sector in education. I've done private, I've done charter, and I've done public. And one of the interesting things about working in a private school, to your earlier point, it was a Catholic school, so the conversation about values as a part of the conversation was never questioned. I think this is a juicier problem. There's complex pieces of working in faith-based schools regardless, but it's a juicier problem in the public sector because you then have to say, hey y'all, is worth investing some money in an ethicist because, insert justification here, right? And I think putting that line in the ground is fundamentally in the public imagination a moral claim, right? Like it's worth putting money into doing the right thing. The right thing deserves criteria bigger than what we've got going right now. So it would imply a big decision on the part of a lot of fancy people that I think is really why we have the gap, right? So like if we, in the medical field, in certain hospitals, if they're willing to pony up the money for this, I'd love to know historically what got them there to say that the bioethicist was worth it. Mm-hmm. Because I think that's actually gonna help us get to why the educational ethicist would be worth it, right? And there's a million cases where I can say right now that, yeah, that might have been worth it. Like, have any of you ever been to an IEP special education mediation? Conflict resolution mediation. Tell me that was not an ethical conversation. Mm-hmm. But the mediator is hired to find the least damaging option for both parties, not the ethically correct outcome. So we do put some money into mediation to avoid litigation, y'all. But doing the right thing, I think, is still considered luxury and not basic. And I think that's where we are, I don't know, blame society or whatever. But until you make a line in the sand kind of decision to say this is worth it, because either democracy or kids or something rests on it, I think you're just gonna keep seeing the divide.
So what I'm also hearing a tension here that I think says a lot about our presumptions about what it means to do ethical reasoning and to have a field of something. And that is that, here's the tension. On the one hand, you're saying, I think all three of you have said in different ways, we need people whose job it is and who have expertise to sit down without impossible pressures and reason about educational ethics, come up with criteria, weigh values against each other, triage, think about obligations to broader society and not just the immediate people in an ethical dilemma. We need, in other words, philosophers and ethicists who can apply their tools to slow down and think through problems. At the same time, not only are they not the ones actually in the seat of the teacher or the principal or many people who are making decisions, although I hasten to add, professors and academics are also making ethical decisions all the time. It's not like we don't have people to whom we're in ethical relationship. But compared to the nuts and bolts of especially formal education, compulsory education that we're talking about, on the one hand, their guidance might be needed and even sought by people who lack the time or have their hands tied or are just putting out fires all the time. At the same time, and I've heard this stated in many cases, the way that they are liable to reason about educational ethics with hypothetical examples or principles or abstract scenarios simply don't apply in the way that practitioners often need, hence normative case studies are an invaluable tool, but that if they're doing what they're doing best, it either doesn't get to the place it needs to in time or it's not delivered in the format that people need, and that if the people in the place who need it could do it themselves, it would actually probably look different. And then even if teachers might need it, as you're saying, Carolina, people will understandably ask for a justification for bringing more of that abstract ethical reasoning into institutions and spaces where they have so many pressing needs. Of course, that's also an ethical question. They may not realize they're also employing ethical reasoning on some level. They're appealing to an ethical standard to say, that's not important, we should actually be funding this thing instead of hiring an educational ethicist. But if you're in such crisis all the time and under such conditions of scarcity that you don't even have time to realize that an educational ethicist could help you with those problems, then no wonder there's a tension here. So I think this says a lot about the tension between what we think academic thinking is and what we think educational practice is, and how ethics is both thought about and reasoned through and acted. It's enacted. What do you want to say about that? I mean, is this a tension? What should we do about it?
I mean, I think my initial response is like, well, both and. We need both. We need philosophers to think differently and more expansively and more creatively about their work in conversation with lots of different diverse publics, and to get some other tools for thinking about, entering into spaces of reasoning with people in conversation. But I also think the way you start movements is you can't be the person who carries that movement, right? You need other people who take up the questions and concerns that you want to see in spaces that you will never be part of, right? And so that's where I think, sure, philosophy needs to change and philosophers need to change. We need to think about this field and the different kinds of skills that are required. But we also need to think about embedding ways of thinking about the ethical valence of issues of policy and practice across curriculum, right? Across teacher education, across leadership preparation, across professional development, to lift up those moments and give people language for naming it, for carrying the questions into spaces where it's not practical, as Carolina, I think, very beautifully laid out, for philosophers to be. Yeah. So I think both things need to happen.
One thing that I was just thinking about as both of you were speaking is the way that this field of DEIJ, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, has really grown in, say, the last decade or so, where school districts, universities, corporations now have a sort of director of DEIJ, and that's become a sort of expected kind of role. And, there are problems with that as well, and that, we know that there are things that work and things that don't work, and to move the needle on some of the issues that are really critical related to DEIJ. But I just, maybe there's some learnings from that field, right? So identifying the critical issues, building habits of mind and thinking in the community that you are serving, right? I think that's one of the roles of these, I don't know what they're called, like CDOs, right, Chief Diversity Officers, so building that and really making that a part of the way that people think about the work that they do. I think that's what they have been really good at. It's sort of elevating some of these issues. And I think educational ethics, maybe there's a kind of parallel or some learnings from that field, at least, as it's grown.
That makes a lot of sense. And it also connects to something else I wanted to ask about, which is, what do you think would be the value of adding some kind of mandatory or more, thorough ethical training for practitioners, educators, but also maybe policymakers and principals and so on? As we know, it's not really a robust part of the training that they go through to enter the profession yet. Although I do think, again, if you look at other professions like medicine, there's at least some baseline of expected training in that. How much do you think more upfront training and preparation for the people who are then kind of divorced from the academy in their practice of education and ethical reasoning would help? What would that look like? Then I also have I want to add a caveat, because I feel like this is a bit of dangerous territory in the vein of offloading even more onto teachers. Yeah. And I mean, is there also perhaps an ethical risk here of sort of promoting ethical reasoning for practitioners of various types in education when many of them work under constraints that effectively limit their moral agency, almost like promising them more moral agency than they actually have?
I think we got to rethink that question, because I don't know that ethicists and philosophers, like, girl, I love you. We've had a lot of conversations about many things, but I don't think they're ready yet to say anything to teachers. I'm serious though, like, y'all need to spend some time in classrooms and then talk to me about philosophy.
That's the tension I'm talking, that's the tension.
But no, really, y'all want a field, stick some people in the classrooms and then talk to me. Because I think if you talk to anybody who even graduated from this institution and gets thrown into a classroom 5 minutes after receiving the diploma, they're like, wow, they didn't teach me that. And this is no different, right? So like, what did I like about Mira's class? Oh, we sat there with those case studies that I wrote because it popped up in my class, right? So it's like, I don't know how you're gonna train somebody on some abstract reasoning without having understood the like normative conflicts of the moment and the context and how it affects humans, right? So this idea of continually training people on things that are divorced from context doesn't work, has not worked. And in fact, it's like the biggest challenge I have as a school leader is actually understanding that like, some of you were beautifully trained in blah, 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 but when you walked in, I had to start from scratch. And let me be real about that, because y'all paid a lot of money for that degree, and I'm up in here trying to reteach from brass tacks. And so there's a really interesting, like, the question itself speaks to an assumption of superiority of the field that has something to say to educators, where I would say maybe educators have something to say to y'all because they're the most passionate people I know who will fight tooth and nail the systems and the humans that try to hurt their babies, right? So like, there's something about, like I really liked that idea that you had about like reasoning versus reason. Because even in classrooms, kids change their mind, humans change their minds. I've changed parents' minds. That conversation with the parent about like, hey, there's a trans child in the bathroom. By the end of the conversation, we got to a different place, right? It's possible. These aren't abstract field things. And so I think we got to challenge the idea that like training is the solution to better reasoning. If you're saying as a philosopher that reasoning is the like means to the end of better decisions, right? Like better outcomes for humans. And I think that idea is much more attractive to me because usually in schools you protocol conversations very tightly. There's rules about how to engage so that all the stakeholders are heard. The conversation's productive, nobody goes on like a random tangent. There's a lot of rules to how to have conversations, and I think that's where you can sort of like get an entry point in that I'd be interested in like seeing in a school.
That's a perfect segue to the next part of our conversation. Oh. Do you want to say one more thing?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think these are great suggestions. I think training sounds terrible, right? Like we've all been part of like mandatory trainings or quizzes, but like embedded, ground-directed cases of ethical reasoning that occur over time are, I think, the way to go. And I also think, to your other question, I think that, about the risks of encouraging educators to think about the ethical dimensions of their work when their moral agency is constrained. There are always risks of demoralization in these organizations, but those exist whether or not we talk about those risks. And I actually think there might be some protective power about recognizing and naming what teachers certainly know, I think, about the deep moral dimensions of their work, right?
Natasha, do you want one word on this before we go to Q&A?
No, I mean, I was just thinking about, I was like, well, how does this apply to higher education? I was thinking like, I've met so many like former admissions officers who have exactly that. They go in with these ideas about what they want to do and then have very little agency to kind of enact those ethical, their ethical stance around inclusion in elite education because of the constraints. And then that feels very real, yeah.
Okay, we're going to open this up to your questions now. So there's 2 microphones in the aisles. Please introduce yourself before you ask a question. Please ask a question. You can direct it to any particular panelist or to the whole panel. Randy.
Thank you. I found that. Introduce yourself. Oh, I'm Randy Curran. You'll see me moderating this afternoon. I thought this was wonderful. So I think the opening session left something implicit, which is the idea of launching this field is an idea of launching a professional specialization. And any such proposal is going to come with a number of questions, one of which is about how we certify that people are properly prepared to give sound ethical advice. right? Because that's what's at stake. Should we have something like ethics panels at universities or schools comparable to ethics panels in hospitals? So I think the biomedical ethics parallel is really important, but I think the DEIJ is a really important one. And the other one that came to mind listening to you was the advent in just the last 15 years of sustainability officers. So, I mean, I've personally been involved in training
Question,
a bunch of, yeah, and so here's the, I'm gonna throw down the gauntlet here. I mean, and just focusing on DEIJ, there are a lot of people who have the impression that ethics, morality is over here and is something really bad, and that social justice is over here and it's something really good and that it's intuitive. And the whole premise of this is that ethics is not intuitive. It requires some training, some expertise. I'd like you to comment on that contrast.
Gauntlet passed.
Go, professors, go.
I'm not sure I understand the contrast. You're saying that,
The contrast is nobody thinks they need specific training
okay,
in DEIJ, but it's a profession that's emerging.
okay.
Did everyone hear that? That was off mic. No one feels like they need specific training in DEIJ, but it is a profession.
Right. And there's a parallel to ethics, is what you're saying. Yeah. I guess when you were talking, the thing that I was thinking about is like, how do we, like, is it, I don't know the field of bioethics, so I don't know if this has come up. I imagine it did, certainly during COVID. Like, there's, our K-12, I feel like even in the past year or so, even more so, has become so politicized, and that like what is considered like an ethical dilemma, parents' rights, like I don't see that as an ethical dilemma in the way that it's framed in, say, you know, book bans or, you know, the, what's it, don't say gay kind of legislation. But it can, those things can be framed as ethical dilemmas, or, you know, what does it mean to be, what's it called? Non-discrimination. Is affirmative action racial discrimination? Like, to me, that's not really an ethical, that's a sort of false ethical dilemma. But so I think some things, the way things get framed can be politicized in a way that makes it hard to, like, who gets to decide what's an ethical dilemma and what's a sort of politicized kind of framing using ethics? I don't know. That's what I was thinking about. And maybe that's the other end of that is the social justice contrast that you pose. Because that phrase social justice is kind of a funny one. I always think, like, isn't everybody for social justice? It's just, but we have different ideas about like what that means, right?
Right. I actually think that the grounding it in the examples is really, really useful. So I really appreciate like us thinking about like, how is it that even pretty rapidly in the last decade, most campuses are now having a kind of leadership position around, we call it JEDI on my campus, but justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. And I also think the environmental officer is a really interesting example to look at too. But I would say that the boundaries of those things are pretty blurry, right? But that doesn't mean that they're immune to internal critique and debate about what is good work in that space. Yeah. That's how fields sort of coalesce. And I would say, at least among students in our higher education program and people on campus, I think actually there's quite a lot of really important criticism of the performative aspects of a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion work on college campuses, and the lack of structural changes that directly benefit students. And I think students are organizing around those changes. They're pushing back on the idea that we could solve these issues of inclusion by just appointing an associate vice chancellor of something. And I think that they're starting to like ask questions about what that good work would look like, what qualifies as good or effective work in that space. And I imagine those same conversations are happening in the environmental example, and it would be interesting to trace how those boundaries get drawn.
To sharpen it, all of those are in the space of education ethics. But those are happening, and we're not, as education ethicists.
I think Randy's question picks up on something else I was pushing all of you on in the conversation, which is this notion of expertise or a field and the implicit hierarchy of academics or elites as the bearers of expertise, which I don't want to discount, especially in this, anti-expertise age we live in. It's a fine balance. We're talking about the different kinds of expertise that reside in different places and what happens when the disconnects between them are not addressed. But there's also a real risk of sort of letting people self-appoint as experts or authorities on especially major complicated ethical issues in virtue of something else other than kind of what we agree on as ethical expertise. Ksenia.
So I'm Ksenia. I'm from Boston College. And, I want to thank Carolina for painting such a beautiful portrait of life in a school and the life of a teacher in a school. And as you were speaking, I started to get worried that, we are hoping potentially to create a new class of educational ethicists that might, that can serve to outsource the thinking that needs to happen in the practice. And I think you've alluded to this tension a lot on the panel. And I worry that if we gravitate too far in that direction, then the kind of frantic and frankly inhumane conditions of teachers' labor will just be allowed to carry on in their present form. Because we have now added this extra element that we can say, well, teachers don't have time. They can't pause in their practice. And so therefore we have these, ethicists or whatever, any other resource that's a kind of outsourcing. You talked about how teachers' moral agency is constrained. So I'm wondering, should it not be the work of this field to liberate teacher moral agency? Where is the space for thinking about how the practice, the nature of the practice of teaching and the conditions of teachers' work need to change? So yes, the conditions are giving rise to this like, hey, we don't have time to think. Can we talk more about the conditions of teachers' work and the way in which, at least from my perspective, the hope is that all teachers feel themselves to be moral agents and feel that they can do that work with integrity.
Thank you for the question. I forgot to remind you to introduce yourself.
I introduced myself. Ksenia from Boston College.
Oh, it was so fast I missed it. Sorry. Okay.
I appreciate the framing on that because I think it opens possibility that ethicists, if they work in different realms of the work, and if we actually stuck them in classrooms, they would have different ethical issues to talk about at the upper echelons of like the superintendent's office, right? Or like, the state, whatever. Different things would get posed than they are being right now, right? And to your earlier point about like outsourcing decision-making, I think a good ethicist, what they would be able to do, which I'm having this experience as we speak right now. I don't usually get to use this part of my brain during the school day, which is a crime because teaching is the most intellectually rigorous work I have ever undergone in my life. Because you will have to use every piece of your brain. But this piece, I'm like trying to dust off the corners, right? In the sense that I think it would elevate and honor the brilliance of our educators to be able to help them reframe what they do as profoundly beautiful problems that are more worth spending time on than the train dilemma. And I think that would actually, the possibility in this is to be able to really treat the work with the kind of dignity it deserves. Because every single day you have some enormous ethical dilemma that when reframed by someone who has more remove, empowers you to realize how sacred the work is and how big the decisions are. And so I think if wielded right, we have an opportunity to do something ennobling for the profession.
Natasha, Terri?
I would say I really appreciate the question. I mean, I think this kind of gets at a little bit of the both and issue, like to recognize that there might be distinct but complementary roles, and that we can't like substitute like developing like a field with people who do educational ethics with, that can take the place of the deep moral inquiry of teachers, which should be prioritized. But I think, and this might, pick up some insights I gained from you, but I think often we as teachers are doing that work in our minds and in our classrooms behind doors. And I think it speaks to the need for, I think, a little bit of collective action and collective reasoning to do that work more together on our in our classroom team, or our grade teams, in our schools, on our school boards. And I think in analogous ways, we as parents often internalize all these moral dilemmas about parenting and our choices, rather than talking with other parents and organizing to create better conditions for all of our choices. And so I would say it's just an invitation to think collectively.
Natasha, do you want anything?
I mean, I think I agree with everything both of my colleagues have said. I think just thinking about the lessons learned from these other fields like bioethics, but also DIJ and sustainability, and what's worked and what hasn't worked, and some of these tensions between top down, bottom up, like in the field, more collaborative, I think is instructive, right? This is just good teaching, right? And good like professional development, I think applies to educational ethics just as it applies to every other kind of domain, so.
I would also add, I think, and this came up in earlier comments too, but I mean, the question about how to change the working circumstances of teachers so that they might have more meaningful moral agency is also an ethical question. I mean, we could all agree maybe that, sure, the public school system is criminally underfunded, but when you come to the questions of what resources should we direct where, and who should make the decisions, those are also just on a different order ethical questions. It's not like teacher judgment is the only layer of ethical questions that's happening. So it's like there's multi-level ethical demands here, and until at least more of them are satisfied, I think the question is pointing to, it's hard to imagine how other layers are gonna also be satisfied. We're gonna go to the next question. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ada. Hi, Natasha. I am a PhD student here at Hugsy, and my question is very brief. Where, if anywhere, is there space for student voice in educational ethics as a field? And if there isn't any space, how can we develop that space? How can we invite students to the table? Thank you.
I love that question. I mean, I would say yes, 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 absolutely. And the trick is how, but I do think that often, I think some of the best and most rewarding conversations at various levels, from kindergarten all the way to higher education, happen with students about the issues and values they care about in the world. And I think it does speak to the need to more critically invest and embed in civic opportunities, or opportunities for students to think civically across the curriculum and across the grades about the worlds they'd like to see, right? And the tensions that they're negotiating. And I think kids have really powerful, well-developed things to say about these issues and need space. But that has to do with, what we prioritize in the curriculum and the kinds of organization we need to like push back against that.
I mean, I think we've gone back, you guys did case studies for a whole day yesterday, and that is literally one of the juiciest things I've ever done with kids, is to like, hey, we're gonna read some folks, and they have some stuff to say about, like moral dilemmas. Like, Mira, that article you had us read about low-level bureaucrats doing things to like upend the system, I don't remember who wrote that, but it was good. But like some layered texts before you get to a case study to teach kids how to reason through different lenses, that stuff is powerful. Because right now what we do in schools is we're like, okay kids, here's a social issue. What do you think? Yeah. And it's like, cool, we actually didn't expand their imagination morally or develop any literacy. So like there's opportunities for kids to actually engage in this in ways that are much more creative than what we do. But I think it requires, again, what you're saying, like the intentionality around like, this is actually worth the academic time.
We're almost out of time. We have one question, so maybe I could ask Ben to quickly state a question, and then we'll get brief answers.
Super quick. I'm Ben Kotze from the University of Birmingham, and I think Anna Karolina is suggesting a really interesting and arresting rule for our future educational ethicists. They must have been teachers themselves. So I would, just as a provocation, I'd like to ask Anna Karolina, how many years? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? And I'd like to ask the others, Natasha, Terri, and Lauren, and even Mira, do you still want this job if you can only get your ethics license after 5 years in an actual classroom?
Great question.
Great question. I taught 8 years full-time, and I still teach a class every day because I think it's sacred. And I taught 4th grade for a week and a half last month because I had a teacher go out on leave, and we couldn't get coverage. So I've taught in pre-pandemic context, in pandemic context, and post, because I can't tell people what to do if I haven't earned the right.
I do wonder, I think there are lots of ways of being deeply invested and involved in education, but I think that nothing quite compares to the terror and beauty of being responsible for 25 or often 30 students in a classroom. And occasionally remind myself, in our deep pandemic malaise of having no subs, I got a sub license, and then occasionally reminded myself, oh God, this is hard. But I think, to your point though, I wonder about actually not just oh, you had to have done that before, but that there's sort of an alchemy of being in conversation with practitioners with these other kinds of questions and concerns. And so I think about, and I don't know how bioethicists are trained, but the idea of rotations and practices. What we do is student teaching and apprenticeships. Would it be really interesting to do an apprenticeship on a school board, right? To think about how do we lift up the ethical questions? How do I marshal evidence and reasons, and how do I advise? Could I do it, in the context of a principal's office and in the context of, a 4th grade team, right? To be part of that and to sort of notice what's happening both in the moral decisions teachers are making all the time, countless ways, but the decisions teachers make together, and to lean into those opportunities to facilitate that. To me, that seems a little more interesting than just requiring that we were teachers, although that is not a bad idea either.
Because it could also be ethically just bad to put a philosopher in front of a room full of kids, because that ain't fair to the kids, right? Maybe y'all can't do that because it takes some, you know what I mean? It's very
But if
different
they were
training.
trained teachers, I think is also implicit there too. They would have had to go through teacher training first.
Yeah, I agree that you need that experience. I remember going to start my PhD and feeling and I was a former teacher and being oh my God, and people had just come out of college and talking about big educational questions. I was they haven't stepped in a classroom since they were in high school. And talking, dumping on teachers and the usual. So I think this is true just in general, right? That if we're gonna speak to a field, we have to have familiarity and ongoing familiarity. But I also just wanna broaden out, because we're talking so much about teachers, but so many of the ethical dilemmas are being resolved. So to your point that teachers do have autonomy and should have more autonomy and moral autonomy, but there's so many decisions that are happening at other levels, at the school board, at the, the policy, the state policy level, at the, I just came back from this conference that was all the ed tech people, and I was the amount of money at this conference and what it's going to in education when we're constantly talking about, should we have an ed ethics or should we have another teacher? And, there's so much money that people want to spend in education, but they want to spend it private. They are making so many ethical decisions that I disagree with, and perhaps some people in this room would disagree with. But how do we bring those ethical, highlight those questions? But then also, where's the leverage, right? I guess that comes back to my other point of okay, you have schools and school districts or universities, but as a society, we're making decisions about tax policy, about how people get paid, about, tax break, all of these things that are ethical decisions that are affecting what's happening in schools. And I don't know how you do that, but hopefully
Mandatory ethical training for everyone, always.
Yeah, that's right.
You're not allowed to graduate junior high without
But
ethics.
we don't think about that.
We don't.
All those tech people aren't thinking about okay, we're putting all this money into this big fancy AI thing. there's finite resources. I don't know, it kind of made me crazy. And I don't know how you sort of, and there's no space to kind of elevate those questions. Yeah.
So we do have to wrap up this amazing conversation. Ben, since you asked my opinion as well, I just want to say university teaching is also teaching, and it's important to focus on the particular challenges and skills needed to teach K to 12, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other kinds of teaching. I've taught in universities for 20 years, and I feel like that still involves pedagogy and planning and triage and ethics in many of the ways that it does in schools, although I was married to a high school teacher, and I always said I couldn't do what you do. So I think an appreciation for the different realms of teaching and what they have in common can go some distance in clearing this up. But I think it's a wonderful provocation to say, who are you to tell us what to do if you haven't been in a classroom? So we're going to have to move on, but this was, I think, an incredible way of blowing open the question of what is the field of educational ethics. We've talked about much of the incredible and disparate and urgent work going on in educational ethics and some of the obstacles to really bringing that together into a more recognizable field, some of the intellectual and institutional paradigms, I think, that you've all spoken about that maybe inhibit our recognition of all the different needs in educational ethics and the failure to bring them into a more coherent conversation. So let this be the beginning of filling in some of those gaps, and I hope you all enjoyed the conversation.